Thank you, dear nature, for the blue sky, because it gives me hope. Thank you, dear nature, for fresh air, because it keeps me alive. Thank you, dear nature, for sunlight, because it fills me with energy.
Thank you, dear nature, for moonlight, because it calms my mind.
Thank you, dear nature, for rain, because it washes my worries. Thank you, dear nature, for rivers, because they teach me to flow.
Thank you, dear nature, for oceans, because they remind me of depth.
Thank you, dear nature, for soil, because it supports all life.
Thank you, dear nature, for trees, because they give without asking.
Thank you, dear nature, for forests, because they heal silently. Thank you, dear nature, for flowers, because they spread joy.
Thank you, dear nature, for fragrance, because it uplifts my mood.
Thank you, dear nature, for birds, because their songs soothe me.
Thank you, dear nature, for butterflies, because they show transformation.
Thank you, dear nature, for bees, because they sustain balance.
Thank you, dear nature, for wind, because it refreshes my soul.
Thank you, dear nature, for clouds, because they soften the sky.
Thank you, dear nature, for seasons, because they teach change.
Thank you, dear nature, for spring, because it brings new beginnings. Thank you, dear nature, for summer, because it gives warmth. Thank you, dear nature, for monsoon, because it nourishes the earth.
Thank you, dear nature, for autumn, because it teaches letting go.
Thank you, dear nature, for winter, because it teaches rest.
Thank you, dear nature, for sunrise, because it gives fresh hope.
Thank you, dear nature, for sunset, because it brings closure.
Thank you, dear nature, for stars, because they guide me in darkness.
Thank you, dear nature, for night sky, because it brings peace.
Thank you, dear nature, for mountains, because they give strength.
Thank you, dear nature, for valleys, because they teach humility.
Thank you, dear nature, for hills, because they inspire courage.
Thank you, dear nature, for greenery, because it relaxes my eyes. Thank you, dear nature, for grass, because it grounds me. Thank you, dear nature, for seeds, because they hold miracles.
Thank you, dear nature, for fruits, because they nourish my body.
Thank you, dear nature, for grains, because they feed humanity.
Thank you, dear nature, for water, because it is life itself.
Thank you, dear nature, for fire, because it gives power.
Thank you, dear nature, for earth, because it holds me.
Thank you, dear nature, for sky, because it expands my thoughts.
Thank you, dear nature, for space, because it gives freedom.
Thank you, dear nature, for silence, because it heals deeply.
Thank you, dear nature, for sounds, because they bring aliveness.
Thank you, dear nature, for balance, because it sustains harmony.
Thank you, dear nature, for cycles, because nothing is permanent.
Thank you, dear nature, for patience, because growth takes time.
Thank you, dear nature, for simplicity, because peace lives there.
Thank you, dear nature, for beauty, because it lifts my heart.
Thank you, dear nature, for order, because life flows smoothly.
Thank you, dear nature, for chaos, because it brings evolution.
Thank you, dear nature, for healing energy, because it restores
nature for grounding energy because it stabilizes me.
Thank you, dear nature, for freshness because it renews me.
Thank you, dear nature, for abundance because nothing is lacking.
Thank you, dear nature, for generosity because giving is natural.
Thank you, dear nature, for protection because life feels safe.
Thank you, dear nature, for guidance because I am never lost.
Thank you, dear nature, for lessons because wisdom grows quietly.
Thank you, dear nature, for connection because all is one.
Thank you, dear nature, for supporting life because we belong here.
Thank you, dear nature, for unconditional love because you give endlessly.
Thank you, dear nature, for holding us all
Because we are your